Welcome back, everybody. So, we are continuing and concluding our conversation on attachment. So, let's dive into implications. So, why does any of this even matter? So, secure attachment has been linked to emotional well being and quality of future relationships. Research has shown that infants who are securely attached at 12 months have some positive effects down the road compared to their insecurely attached peers. So, some infants were followed from 12 months until adolescence, as a longitudinal study. And at 3 years old, these securely attached infants and now children were more curious, they played more effectively with their peers, and they had better relationships with teachers as opposed to their insecurely attached peers. At 15 years old, they were more skillful socially. They had more friends, displayed more self confidence, and were more open in expressing their feelings. So, this just illustrates some potential long term effects of having secure attachment in infancy. Now, let's also talk about something called an internal working model. So, kids seem to form an internal working model. This is just how to behave toward other people based on interactions with the caregiver. This is thought to guide behavior in all future relationships. And it creates expectations for how others are likely to respond to the child. So, do they expect to be comforted, accepted, or do they expect to be rejected? And it also influences how the children act in new situations with new people, this internal working model. So their actions will provoke either positive or negative reactions in others, which will further confirm the child's expectations and kind of lock in patterns of behavior. So, as you can see, it's kind of a cycle that's hard to break. It's difficult to change a child's internal working model once it's formed, and it can be adaptive or maladaptive. So, research suggests that attachment patterns may impact brain development and this internal working model, which further illustrates the implications and the importance of attachments. Now, what about transmission? So, can attachment patterns be transmitted from parent to child? So, there is actually little evidence to support this. Mothers' attachment patterns don't seem to predict child attachment patterns in most cases, except in the case of disorganized attachment. So, research has shown that children with mothers who have a disorganized attachment pattern are more likely to form disorganized attachments themselves. So, why is this? What causes these intergenerational effects? Well, disorganized attachment is associated with frightening or chaotic caregiving. Remember, going back to that kind of perceived fear, right? Can be potentially harmful to the child. And it's known to be associated with mental health implications, problems in later life, including personality disorders, which can possibly continue that cycle of disorganized caregiving and attachments, and goes to that idea of intergenerational trauma and mental health. So, those are some implications of these attachment patterns down the road. Um, Lastly, let's talk a bit about cultural context. So, how does culture impact attachment? Is the strange situation procedure and attachment theory appropriate for families that aren't middle class and aren't living in westernized societies? So, there's some criticisms here with the strange situation and attachment theories we've went over. So, they're largely based on mother-child relationships. This is one criticism. There's bias toward mothers, as you may have noticed. It was a strange situation was solely looking at mothers and children. Sorry, but what about fathers and other caregivers? In many cultures around the world, babies spend considerable time with fathers and other caregivers. This also could vary by socioeconomic status. Sometimes mothers work and other caregivers step in. It's not always the mother, it's that primary caregiver. And what about non parental caregivers like grandparents and siblings and daycare providers? So, research has actually shown that about 42% of children are securely attached to their daycare providers. And that kind of makes sense. A lot of children spend much of their day with these providers. So much of existing research on attachment focuses on mothers, and it may not be getting that full picture and may not be representative of all children. That's one thing to consider. Another criticism is the focus on exclusive one-to-one relationships. Many babies receive care from networks of caregivers, otherwise known as one-to-many, instead of one-to-one. This is especially common in families living near or below the poverty line in the US. Another example is the Aka people in Central African Republic. Uh, in these people, there's multiple caregivers from birth. In fact, there's approximately 20 caregivers per day. So there really is a network going on here, right? And another thing is that the infants within the, Aka culture, they'll often be breastfed by multiple women who aren't the mother. And the attachment behaviors in these babies were found to be very different from the patterns described in the previous attachment theories we went over in the strange situation. Another thing is sometimes children have relationships with a broader community rather than as a member of a nuclear family. For example, in Sri Lanka, many children are not only cared for by a complex network of caregivers, but also live in different households throughout childhood. So how does this affect attachment? What is considered, how does the patterns of attachment manifest in these types of cultures? So this illustrates that we need to look at diversity of infant care worldwide, and maybe not just highly westernized middle class cultures. It emphasizes the importance of expanding cultural context within the theories of attachment. So that's just one note to end on. That concludes our discussion on attachment. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Next, we'll talk about some other areas like communication, sense of self, and trust and autonomy. And that's where we'll end for the day. So thanks, everyone. I'll see you in the next section.